So, American Vice President and noted Anglophile JD Vance is holidaying in the Cotswolds in the last week. You can see him here meeting and mogging the Foreign Secretary David Lammy, living proof that there's a village somewhere deprived of his idiot. It's quite funny, actually. Vance and his kids caught lots of fish, whereas David Lammy didn't, and it seems that he might have even broken the law, because in this joke of a country you need a fishing license to get your tackle out and go and catch some fish. You know, on reflection, that sounded like an innuendo, didn't it? Anyway, so Vance wasn't met with overwhelming praise with people on the left, because a bunch of Soros-funded astroturfed protests showed up. They decided to, well, use notably homemade signs this time, I think because they recognised that the Stand Up to Racism renter mob wasn't exactly looking the most organic when they were recycling their pre-printed placards from 2020. But of course, the same middle-class boomer leftists who live very far from the consequences of the policies they support, like infinity number of Muslim refugees being stockpiled in Leeds, Luton, Leicester, Bradford, London, take your pick. They are off in the Cotswolds, where it is overwhelmingly white English, yet they're still obsessed with Palestine for some reason, despite the population there being very happy to decapitate a lot of them. And then they decided to, and this is Zoe Gardner here, put Vance's face from that one meme that he finds really funny on a Colin the Caterpillar cake. Again, very telling that they get most of their protest sustenance from Marks and Spencer's, very middle-class supermarket. Nice place, but still very upmarket and progressive. Zoe Gardner, as Charlotte Gill points out, went on a activist boot camp, something called Neon, which is actually funded by the Soros Open Society Foundation. So she is just another astroturf leftist who gets platformed by the BBC and Sky to tell us why borders are racist and why we should destroy our own countries. Thank you very much, you subversive communists. Also, they drove a giant van around the Cotswolds with this meme of Vance's face on it, and they put it up on a big billboard. Again, Vance finds this funny. This is the exact same tactic, by the way, that patriotic millionaires use. They use the same vans to drive around London, patriotic millionaires, another Soros-funded group, to say, hey, we're actually really wealthy, but the wealthy should pay even more in tax. Bear in mind, you're more than welcome to make a voluntary donation to HMRC. Instead, you're just trying to manufacture consent for progressive policies that end up inflicting ridiculous amounts of costs on young professionals so that they can't buy a home, start a family, and those who have the means to leave, which is why we've lost 16,500 millionaires in the last year, and that is more than any other country, including China. So Britain is going seriously badly in terms of its economics, but also in terms of its civil liberties. And this is something that the State Department have noticed. I have spoken to good chaps in the State Department. They are our guys this time, after they've just fired a bunch of ideologues that were attached like barnacles to the permanent bureaucracy, who left behind posters saying, remember, those behind are fighting fascism. It's like, oh, sorry. I don't think there's a single member of the Trump administration who sleeps with a copy of Giovanni Gentili and Benito Mussolini's Doctrine of Fascism under their pillow every night. But they have produced a report on human rights practices and abuses in the UK, and it's worth going through because this is how the Americans are starting to see us. Britain is becoming a pariah state, and I wouldn't be shocked if soon they start accepting free speech refugees from the UK and the rest of the Anglosphere, given Australia, Canada, New Zealand are all following the UK like lemmings off a cliff. I wouldn't be shocked if America starts taking in hordes of people from the motherland, you know, actual native Brits, who are being persecuted by our own government, because if you do the acceptable form of protest, like these middle-class, pro-Palestine, pro-migrant people are, you are funded by the government. If you do an unacceptable form of protest, for example, complaining about Islam, mass immigration, grooming gangs, illegal migrant sex criminals, or just liberal progressive excesses like abortion and assisted dying, well, then the government come down on you like a ton of bricks and treat you like a terrorist. They've even got a new counter-terror unit that was established in 2017 to monitor ISIS posts, now dedicated to monitoring anti-migrant sentiment online. So let's see what the US State Department think of the UK. And I read this report, and I'm slightly critical of it because it actually understates how bad things are, but I appreciate that at least some of the people in the State Department have an eye on the way that we are just being taken advantage of and exploited by our own government and their foreign client groups. So, executive summary: the human rights situation worsened in the United Kingdom during the year. Just definitive, opening, damning. Significant human rights issues included credible reports of serious restrictions on freedom of expression, including enforcement of or threat of criminal or civil laws in order to limit expression, and crimes, violence, or threats of violence motivated by anti-Semitism. Now, we'll get to the anti-Semitism section later. I understand this is a priority for the Trump administration. That is a value-neutral analysis. That is just, they've made it very clear. There was a scandal, I think, about a week ago where the Trump administration were trying to tie FEMA disaster relief into whether or not a state had engaged in boycott, divest, and sanction practices against Israel, and they quickly undid that. But it does show you that the combating of anti-Semitism globally and domestically, and the staunch support of Israel is a key priority for the administration, and so it's factored in here. I would much rather a focus on anti-native, anti-white racism, because that is written into our laws, whereas anti-Semitism, even though it goes on de facto in Britain, and there are thousands of Jews leaving, there are synagogues closing that are being converted into mosques, historic Jewish areas like Golders Green are being emptied out, and you can't get a salt bagel anywhere for love nor money. Even though that is the case, it is not written into law that Jews are penalised. So this is a de facto level of discrimination, but it is both de facto and de jure that white Britons are treated like second-class citizens in their own country. And I think that should have got some more attention in this report. Anyway, it says, the government sometimes took credible steps to identify and punish officials who committed human rights abuses, but prosecution and punishment for such abuses was inconsistent. Well, it's totally absent in all of the officials who assisted in the cover-up of the Pakistani grooming gang scandal for decades. We know from Dominic Cummings that there were officials in the previous Blair and Brown, but also Cameron and onwards administration, civil service, who at the Department of Education knew of the grooming gangs and instead tried to take out injunctions against people like Andrew Norfolk, who tried to report them. We know the Home Office was funding communist groups like Hope Not Hate, not to just do their sort of dirty work, undercover policing, sting investigations for them on the far right, again, defined as readers of Douglas Murray and cultural nationalists, but also they were writing hit pieces on sitting MPs and people like Tommy Robinson for raising awareness about the grooming gangs. Again, you don't have to back or like any of these individual people to know that the government were working to proactively gaslight the population to hold a positive opinion of Islam and immigrants, even though there were known thousands of victims of these gangs. And so nobody has lost their job for that. Lots of people were promoted in spite of being involved in the cover-up, and nobody has been prosecuted for misconduct in public office about it. So, starts at section 1, life. Extrajudicial killings. There were no reports the government or its agents committed arbitrary or unlawful killings. Untrue, Peter Lynch. Peter Lynch, being the 61-year-old grandfather who was imprisoned for peaceful protest outside a migrant hotel in Rotherham during the post-Southport protests and riots, who, thanks to a heart condition and presumably fearing for his life in prisons that are controlled by a gang called the Muslim Brotherhood, he seems to have hanged himself in his cell. And he would not have been there in the first place if the state, as directed by Keir Starmer, the head of public prosecutions as well, had not gone after all of the protesters and put them on remand for a very long time, given them state-funded legal advice, which the Free Speech Union believed to be of poor quality, to strong-arm them into pleading guilty to incitement to racial hatred charges, and imprisoning them for 2 years while unleashing violent criminals onto our streets in waves of early release to apparently ease overcrowding, to lock up people like Peter Lynch or Wayne O'Rourke or Judy Sweeney or Lucy Connolly or a number of other people imprisoned after the protests and riots. And they do actually mention that in here in this report, but they don't link it to Lynch, so that's something that's been missed. B. Coercion in population control. There were no reports of involuntary sterilisation on the part of the government authorities. Untrue. Thousands of children being sterilised at the Tavistock Clinic, despite the executives at the clinic knowing full well that the side effects from puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones were irreversible. worsened female adolescent mental health. They knew of the high referral rates for children in care who had parents who were registered sex offenders, who had up to 5 comorbidities like eating disorders and autism. They knew all of this, and they continued on with it anyway because of a commitment to gender ideology. So again, I feel like that qualifies and it's missed a trick here. Section 2. Liberty. Freedom of the press. The law generally provided for freedom of speech, including for members of the press and other media, and the government generally respected this right, though there were specific areas of concern, including involving restrictions on political speech deemed hateful or offensive, as well as speech within public spaces protection orders areas, allowing local councils to limit speech rights within designated areas, and safe access zones limiting speech rights around abortion clinics. Right. The law generally provided for freedom of speech. If it does not provide for freedom of speech in all cases, it doesn't provide for freedom of speech, because freedom of speech is itself a freedom to speak. If you curb our ability to speak, it's a binary between freedom of speech and censorship. So again, I disagree with this, but I appreciate them pointing out that there were limits on hateful or offensive speech under the Public Order Act 1986, under the Malicious Communications Act 1988, under the Communications Act 2003, and under the Online Safety Act 2023 that's just come into effect, where over 12,000 people are arrested every year for posts online, and even more for posts or speech made in public. And then they, of course, mention the abortion buffer zones, where the likes of Isabel Vaughan-Spruce or Adam Smith-Connor or Livy Tosiki-Bolt have been arrested and prosecuted for praying silently in their head or holding signs offering conversations to consenting adults about abortions and either praying for the murdered unborn children or telling mothers there is another choice to murdering your child. There was also the passage of this in Scotland, and it got to the absurd position where a Scottish minister said, I think it was on BBC Radio, that if you were seen praying silently in your head in your own house and you happen to live within the vicinity of a buffer zone, you could be prosecuted. There's also the dwelling defence has been dismantled, the dwelling defence being that you can't be prosecuted for things you say inside your own home. The dwelling defence was not only dismantled by the Scottish hate crime bill that Hamza Yusuf brought forward and brought into effect on the 1st of April 2024, ironically, but also the dwelling defence has been dismantled by non-crime hate incidents. In 2014, the hate crime operational guidance implemented after the 1999 Macpherson report, which accused the Met Police of being institutionally racist, without any evidence, by the way. It was proper Stalinist show trial where police had to confess to the private racist thoughts of other police officers. Anyway, after the hate crime operational guidance was brought forward, the police, in order to defend themselves against charges of racism, started recording non-crime hate incidents, so complaints of offence by someone with a protected characteristic under the Equality Act, basically anyone who isn't a straight white Christian male. They started recording them against members of the public, not informing them that this was on their permanent record, that it could show up on a DBS check, an advanced background check, prohibit them from public sector employment, and the police were discouraged from engaging in secondary victimisation, which meant asking the offended person for evidence. Also, the person who was accused of a non-crime hate incident couldn't face their accuser because they had to be protected, because their identity was that of a protected characteristic, so the police were just going around branding people with scarlet letters. And even after Suella Braverman, while Home Secretary, tried to legislate against this, the effect was actually that they increased in the number that were recorded, that the dwelling defence was dismantled, so you could get a non-crime hate incident for something said inside your own home, and now new Home Secretary Yvette Cooper wants to increase recording them for anti-Semitic and Islamophobic hate crimes. You would think that the two would contradict, given the hadiths about what happens on Judgment Day to the Jews, but cognitive dissonance is not something that bothers our ruling elite, is it? Next one. The law prohibited expressions of hatred towards persons because of their colour, race, nationality, including citizenship, ethnic or national origin, religion, or sexual orientation, as well as any communication that was deemed threatening or abusive and was intended to harass, alarm, or distress a person. The penalties for such speech included fines, imprisonment, or both. There were laws in the United Kingdom that restricted freedom of speech in certain areas or allowed councils to establish areas with restrictions on freedom of speech. Yes, we do not have a First Amendment. Now, of course, lots of these censorious ideological practices were imported back from American college campuses, the progressive movement of the 60s, the sort of new left at Berkeley, and the practices of Silicon Valley after the Trump election in 2016. Remember everyone at Google weeping and holding an emergency meeting with all of their staff We remember the likes of Twitter's trust and safety team infested with federal agents who were selectively discriminating against certain users. There were the backdoor access that the Biden administration had to the likes of Facebook and Twitter during COVID, where they could target things like Anthony Fauci parody accounts with barely any followers to take them down and control the narrative around masking, vaccines, and lockdowns. So this happens, again, de facto in America, but it is de jure and getting way worse in the UK. And so, again, I wouldn't be shocked if there were State Department extending, in exceptional circumstances, free speech refugee visas to people in the UK to evacuate them from the governments that are persecuting them, just as they evacuated a number of white South Africans being targeted by their racist government in South Africa. They also mention the law authorised UK authorities, including the Office of Communications Ofcom, to monitor all forms of communication for speech they deemed illegal. The Online Safety Act of 2023, which came into force in 2024, defined the category of online harm and expressly expanded Ofcom's authority to include American media and technology firms with a substantial number of British users, regardless of whether they had a corporate presence in the UK. Basically, the Americans don't like the fact that our government has just appointed the broadcast regulator, who, like Cthulhu always swims left, as the arbiter of what American platforms are allowed to host. And this means that the speech restrictions may not be region locked and they may affect American citizens as well. And also American citizens' ability to see content that is posted from within our country. So this impacts Americans' free speech rights. And so Keir Starmer was lying to Donald Trump's face at Turnberry when he said twice, in response to questions, we aren't censoring anyone. He was just straight up lying. And it mentions here, on April 1st, the Scottish Government implemented the Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Act, including the introduction of offences stirring up hatred through threatening or abusive behaviour and the communication of threatening or abusive material. What they didn't mention is that it got thousands of reports on day one. So not only is this costing loads of money, but it's an entire farce, and all of these crimes, shouldn't be crimes, are perception-based and ripe for abuse. It's a lot like how in Pakistan, if you have annoyed a rival clan, they will just levy a charge of blasphemy against you, which cannot be disproven, and you will be locked up in prison, tortured, and probably put to death, just so they can acquire your assets and land while you languish in prison for offending Muhammad or something. Muhammad being their prophet, not just one of the millions of people named after him, because they're not all that creative, of course. We go on to the workers' rights bit. I want to highlight this just because this is about unions and collective bargaining. What it doesn't mention here is the workers' rights bill being advanced by Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner, which makes employers liable for things said in their establishment. So, for example, if a bar staff server is offended by a conversation they overhear in the pub, they can sue their boss. And so the boss then is responsible for anything said in their pub, which means that pubs themselves are going to have to censor patrons. So that should be mentioned in there. Next time this sort of thing is revised, just recommend anyone who might be listening from Washington, D.C. to take note of that and mention it next time. Then there's about forced or compulsory labour. I mean, I would personally say that all of my taxes being taken at the highest rate since 1948 and spent on the 4-star hotel fees for foreign criminals and sex offenders who are breaking into our country by the thousands, as well as millions spent on refugee households. I think it's actually 7 billion every year that's spent on universal credit. Hundreds of thousands of migrants, I think it's 1/5 actually of foreign nationals are on universal credit. I would say all of that's forced labour because I'm working, they're not, my money's going to them. But there you go. There was also a section here as well on disappearance and abduction. Disappearance, again, no reports of enforced disappearances by or on behalf of government authorities. Untrue. There are police officers participating in the Pakistani grooming gangs that are trafficking, murdering, and vanishing girls all over the country, between 50 towns and cities. The government and state officials have known this has been going on for decades. They are operating at rates higher than ever in history because of mass migration. And we know from the Casey report that illegal migrants are now participating in this. We know that there are grooming gangs in London. Even the BBC's admitted this. But Sadiq Khan is playing dumb, acting like he doesn't even know what they are. And we haven't identified any active grooming gangs in London yet, which doesn't make sense considering the high concentration of a Muslim population, large volume of migration there in the last few years, high population density, and yet we haven't identified or prosecuted any grooming gangs in London. Very suspicious. So yet there are state-sanctioned disappearances going on. It's just not the kind of journalists being abducted off the street and shot in prison or starved to death or poisoned that you would see in Russia, for example. Also, I think probably Peter Lynch goes under this category here. Prolonged detention without charges. Now, this is a very important bit as well. The law prohibited arbitrary arrest and detention and provided for the right of any person to challenge the lawfulness of their arrest or detention in court. Not in effect. Again, lots of people arrested during the post-Southport protests and riots that were put on remand and told, if you plead guilty, you'll be home by Christmas. Given false legal advice, they then pled guilty to offences they didn't actually commit, and have now been given longer prison sentences than actual sex offenders. So this is another problem that has not been addressed yet. There's also a bit on child marriage in here, where it's down here. It's under child labour. Child marriage. There we go. It says the minimum legal age for marriage was 16. In England, Northern Ireland and Wales, persons younger than 18 required the written consent of parents or guardians, and the underage person was required to present a birth certificate. That's all well and good. However, we do have the highest number of Sharia courts in all of Europe. There's upwards of 90 that have been identified by the Times this year that we know are operating. If you don't think there's an epidemic of Islamic child marriage going on in this country, especially with brides being brought over, then I don't know what to tell you. There's multiple bridges that I can sell you. This is absolutely happening. There needs to be some sort of journalistic investigation into this. I hope one is underway. You never know who's doing what in this country at the moment before it's reported. But there is definitely child marriage happening in the UK in the self-governing Islamic enclaves, and more attention needs to be paid to this. Especially, I know they haven't done their violations in freedom of religion report yet, but there needs to be a massive section on the undue influence of Islam, not only over British politics, but the operation of a parallel legal and cultural system taking root in this country and giving privilege by the government over Christianity and common law. Also, provisions of first asylum. In England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, the law provided for the granting of asylum or refugee status, and except for Bermuda, the governments had systems for providing protection to refugees. Yes, too generous. I mean, I think it's about 2/3 of all refugee applications are given grants, and even those who are rejected get second appeal and get to stay in the country indefinitely due to the massive human rights infrastructure of which Keir Starmer was a key contributor, because he wrote the textbook in 1998 on how to apply the Human Rights Act, allowing these inveterate traitors of human rights lawyers to endlessly petition to keep foreign criminals in the country. It notes as well, following the UK's general election in July, the incoming Labour Party government reversed the plans of the Conservative government to transfer asylum seekers to Rwanda under the Safety of Rwanda Act. They did, and don't get me wrong, the Safety of Rwanda deportation and detention scheme was basically a glorified exchange program, because for every one illegal immigrant that we would send over to Rwanda, and we would pay for their bed and board the entire time they were in Rwanda, we would get a Rwandan national to come over to the UK for health tourism. So, absolutely terrible idea. However, it shows that the Labour Party aren't interested in even presenting any kind of deterrent. They have negotiated some sort of Potemkin deterrent plan with Albania earlier in the year, but it didn't come to fruition. They just want to be seen to be doing something, because the purpose of the system is what it does, and the British system imports thousands of foreign criminals and houses them at our expense, because fundamentally, if they don't repeal the laws to remove them from the country, well, you can only presume that the government and the civil service want them here. But it should be noted that after the Rwanda deportation scheme was scrapped, 50,000 illegal migrants have come over since Keir Starmer took power, and 2025 has been the worst year for recorded channel crossings, and we're only just over halfway through it. So this is a major problem. It is, as a scale, not nearly as bad as the southern border was during Joe Biden, where you had at least 12 million recorded illegal migrants crossing in the span of 4 years. But remember, we have a giant geographical moat surrounding our country, and yet we are getting millions of people flying in every single day via the passport gates of Heathrow and Gatwick, and many are overstaying their visas, many are being harboured in houses of multiple occupancy, and also we have thousands of fighting age males who we have known have been sex offenders, terrorists, jihadists, murderers, coming over via small boats or smuggling themselves into lorries and also being housed at our expense and working illegally. So even though we don't have a southern border that's as porous as America's, or before the Trump administration took over, we are still getting the same level of legal migration that Americans get every year, but we are the size of New York State. And a lot of our legal migration is coming from the third world, which presents not just problems of economic unsustainability or cultural compatibility, but serious security concerns and an increase in crime. So I think a lot of that should be considered under here too. And then we get to the final part, which is acts of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic incitement. And look, again, I understand this is a key concern for the Trump administration. However, the Jews leaving the UK should be the second order concern of what is causing them to leave, which is mass Islamic migration. Now, other kinds of migration are also a problem. I don't want Sikhs petitioning for Khalistan, or the Hindus rioting anytime India loses a cricket match, or African Christians sacrificing children to witchcraft. None of those people should be here. We need net negative migration. We need to reverse the Boris wave. We need to deport every single illegal migrant and foreign criminal in this country, no matter their nation or ethnicity of origin. However, the reason the Jews are leaving is because of mass Islamic migration. And this is the same reason that Israel is cutting security ties with the UK. It says here, as reported by The Times, that it's because Starmer's recognising Palestine. It isn't. What it is, you know, MI5 and MI6 have had diversity, equity and inclusion schemes for quite some time. You know, the Home Office, as I've described on my channel before, and with interviews with Andrew Gold, have an Islamic network who run counter-terrorism and even large parts of their immigration policy. Well, the Israelis know that our security services are packed to the rafters with Islamic activists and jihadist sympathizers. And so they don't think it's intelligent to share their intelligence with the UK security services because they're not populated by British nationals. Now, this is a very important image. So Tom Skinner, of course, is considering a run for London Mayor, whether as an independent or as a Conservative candidate has yet to be seen, but JD Vance followed Tom Skinner quite a while ago on Twitter. Grok actually pointed this out to everyone when Tom Skinner said, "Who's the most famous person that has interacted with my account?" And Grok said it was JD Vance. I know that Tom Skinner was very keen to have a chat with JD Vance, and this was a reciprocal interest from both parties. And so, now that JD Vance is in the UK for a brief stint, they decided to have a beer and a barbecue. This was facilitated by our mutual friend, actually, James Orr, who has been a longtime friend and mentor of JD Vance. So there are good people working in the UK to try to bring political change, and it's good that, well, JD Vance is riding around the English countryside like a reverse Paul Revere and mustering the Rohirrim, as it were, to come to our defence. You know, Gondor calls for aid, and Rohan has answered. This has, of course, brought out all of the mentally ill online communists to descend upon Thomas Skinner and say, Thomas Skinner will be Prime Minister by 2035 unless someone does something. Ever wanted to get your name in the history books? Ever wanted to make a difference in life, a real difference? Ever wanted millions to know your name? Your time is now. Right, so just openly threatening him. And saying, oh, no, I absolutely meant that, you know, we should take him for a pint or two and discuss the works of Kropotkin and Engels. No, you didn't. You've got some weird gooning online avatar, so I think you're probably a demented Redditor who spends way too much time on degenerate websites and actually not enough time reading your own Marxist theory, because if you did, you'd realise it's totally bogus and just a way for resentful mutants to try and kill all of their political enemies en masse. And Mr. Skinner, if you're upsetting individuals like this, you're doing something right. There's some more details here in this report in The Times. Basically, Vance had breakfast with Nigel Farage on Wednesday morning. He then met with George Osborne, the former Chancellor from the Cameron government, in the garden of Dean Manor. And he also met with Robert Jenrick, who is currently the Shadow Justice Secretary, but of course is the favourite to take over the Conservative Party from Kemi Badenoch, who is cratering in the polls and whose allies are abandoning her like rats leaving a sinking ship. Vance didn't meet with Kemi. Both teams cited a scheduling conflict. So what was Kemi doing that was way more important than meeting the Vice President of the United States at a summit of the collective British right? She was serving ice cream in the Isle of Wight. I mean, everyone knew when Vance was coming over for his holiday. It's not like teams couldn't have been talking. I suspect, actually, Vance himself wasn't that bothered about meeting Kemi because he knows, with his keen eye kept on British politics, that her career is not long for this world, and she could be voted out as early as November, replaced with Robert Jenrick. This is also very interesting. Visitors also included Chris Philp, the Shadow Home Secretary, who has just been out in France with Jenrick, getting threatened with machetes by our imminent new arrivals, the GDP rocket fuel that is awaiting us in the camps of Calais. Laura Trott, who is the Shadow Education Secretary. Katie Lamb, who is the Pantsuit Deportations in Chief Home Office Minister, who is doing a fantastic job on social media and on podcasts. And, of course, she was a former Home Office advisor. And Sir Paul Marshall, owner of GB News, The Spectator, and Unheard. Yes, the same Paul Marshall who is Winston Marshall's dad, the same Paul Marshall who helped runs ARC. He is trying to be a power broker on the right. He has previously backed Kemi Badenoch. He is the man who installed Michael Gove as the head of The Spectator. Michael Gove, whose first action when running The Spectator was to support Kamala Harris in the US election. So I think this is an exercise in trying to redeem the reputation and repair relationships with that particular faction of the Tory party, with the ascendant American right and the likely next president of the United States, especially because they're anticipating Labour to be voted out next time, and they're hoping for, at least at the moment, a Reform Conservative pact with the Conservatives led by Robert Jenrick. And so this is kind of a rapprochement to try to foster ties for when JD Vance becomes president in 2028, God willing, and also as of at least 2029, when Labour are voted out and we get our next government, a combination of Reform, the Conservatives, or just one of them, of course, hence why Vance met with them. And the reason Vance is so interested, as one ally of the Vice President says, he takes a close interest in British politics, not in a broad brush way. You'd be taken aback by how granular his grip is. It's beyond the international headlines. And I think the fact that we have mutuals on X means that he's probably reading the right people. So the American State Department, the Vice President, and probably the President himself, if he gets the time, has an eye on the UK, the human rights abuses and excesses that are being committed here. I don't even like the phrase human rights, actually. They're trampling over the historic customs and liberties that the English believe themselves to be entitled to, and quite rightly so. We, the British people, are being penalised and exploited by our own government for the benefit of hostile criminal foreign nationals, and the entire enterprise needs to end. And so we're grateful that the Americans are paying attention, and we can't wait until you step in with something more substantive.